Welcome. Tonight we will be talking about the boring story of the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. Make yourself comfortable, and don't forget to dim the lights. As the sound of rain shortly begins, try to relax to this piece of history. Enjoy. In the misty heart of 18th century Britain, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The countryside, once quiet, green, and slow-moving, would soon echo with the rumble of machines, the hiss of steam, and the restless energy of progress. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was a transformation so vast that it reshaped not only Britain, but the entire world. A revolution that changed how we work, how we live, and even how we think about time itself. But before the smoke rose from factory chimneys, before the engines roared to life, there was a question that still fascinates historians today. Why Britain? Why did this small island nation become the birthplace of modern industry? Let's travel back to the early 1700s. Britain was still an agricultural society. Most people lived in small villages, working the land, growing food, raising animals, and relying on simple hand tools. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons. In the winter, fields lay dormant. In the summer, they were alive with the sweat and effort of peasants and laborers. For most, life was hard, repetitive, and limited. The idea of social mobility, the chance to move beyond the station you were born into, was almost unthinkable. Yet beneath this seemingly stable society, change was brewing. The population was growing, trade was expanding, and the seeds of innovation were being planted. To understand why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, we have to look at what historians call the perfect storm of conditions. First, Britain had coal out of it. Beneath its rolling hills lay vast coal deposits, the energy source that would soon power steam engines, heat furnaces, and drive the machines of industry. And conveniently, much of that coal was located near rivers and ports ideal for transport. Second, Britain had iron ore. When combined with coal, it became the foundation of machinery, tools, and buildings. Coal and iron, two of the most important ingredients of the modern age, were both within easy reach. Third, Britain had capital money to invest. Its expanding global trade network, fueled by the colonies and the Atlantic slave trade, had made merchants and investors incredibly wealthy. That wealth didn't just sit in vaults. It was reinvested into new technologies, factories, and enterprises. Fourth, Britain had political stability. Unlike much of Europe, Britain wasn't torn apart by frequent wars on its own soil. Its banking system was reliable, property rights were protected, and its government encouraged private enterprise and innovation. And finally, Britain had people, lots of them. A growing population meant more workers for the factories and more consumers to buy goods. After all, a revolution needs not just inventors, but customers. Before the machines, before the steam, came the agricultural revolution. In the early 18th century, a wave of innovations transformed farming. New tools like Jethro Tull's seed drill made planting faster and more efficient. Crop rotation systems like the famous Norfolk four-course system kept soil fertile year after year, and large landowners began enclosing open fields, forcing small farmers off their land and into the growing towns. It was a painful change for many rural families. But it also created a new labor force, men and women who had no choice but to seek work elsewhere. And where would they go? To the towns, to the factories, to the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Every revolution has a spark, and for Britain, that spark was cloth. Before industrialization, spinning and weaving were done by hand in small cottages. It was known as the putting out system. Merchants would put out raw wool or cotton to families who spun and wove it at home. It was slow, inconsistent, and entirely dependent on manual labor. Then, in the 1760s, innovation struck. James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, a device that allowed one worker to spin multiple threads at once. Soon after, Richard Arkwright developed the water frame, powered by running water, capable of producing strong, uniform yarn at an incredible rate. And Samuel Crompton combined the best features of both in his spinning mule, a boom in textile production unlike anything Britain had ever seen. Cotton, once a luxury, became affordable to the masses. Factories sprang up near rivers to harness water power, and towns like Manchester and Leeds began to grow into industrial giants. This wasn't just technological progress, it was a social revolution. Water was powerful but unreliable. Rivers could flood or dry up. Factories could only be built near running water. Then came the invention that would unchain industry forever, the steam engine. It began as a way to pump water out of coal mines. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen built a crude atmospheric engine that used steam to power a piston. It worked, but it was inefficient. Then, in the 1760s and 1770s, James Watt improved the design dramatically. He added a separate condenser that made the engine far more efficient and more versatile. Soon, Watt's engines were driving not just pumps, but textile machines, iron furnaces, and eventually, locomotives. Steam meant factories no longer had to follow rivers. They could rise anywhere. It was quite literally the engine of progress. As steam spread, so too did the demand for coal and iron. Coal mines dug deeper, and the need for stronger, more reliable materials grew. Enter Abraham Darby, who discovered how to use coke, a purified form of coal, instead of charcoal, to smelt iron. This made iron cheaper and more plentiful. Bridges, rails, tools, and machines all became stronger and more affordable. Iron became the backbone of industry and coal its lifeblood. By the end of the 18th century, Britain's landscape was transforming. Chimneys rose where forests once stood. Rivers turned dark with soot. But amid the smoke and clamor, a new kind of prosperity began to take shape. By the dawn of the 19th century, Britain was no longer a sleepy agrarian kingdom. It was the workshop of the world. Goods flowed from its ports to every corner of the globe. Its cities swelled with workers and immigrants, and its inventors became legends: Hargreaves, Arkwright, Watt, Darby, all names forever tied to a new age of innovation. But the revolution that created wealth also created suffering. Factories were dangerous. Children worked long hours. Pollution choked the air and blackened the streets. Britain was changing, but not always for the better. Still, one thing was clear: there was no turning back. The machine age had begun. In the next chapter of this story, we'll explore how steam engines conquered the rails, how iron turned into steel, and how Britain's cities became both the heart of innovation and the center of social struggle. This is the story of power, progress, and people. This is the story of the Industrial Revolution. By the early 19th century, Britain was no longer simply the land of mills and looms. It had become the beating heart of a new industrial age. Smoke poured from the chimneys of Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield. The world was entering an era defined by engines, steel, and speed. The power of steam, once used to pump water from mines and drive textile machines, now took on a far greater challenge: transportation. For centuries, movement had been slow and limited. Goods moved by horse, by canal, or by the wind that filled a ship's sails. But steam changed everything. At the dawn of the 1800s, a handful of engineers began experimenting with steam on wheels. Among them was Richard Trevithick, a Cornish inventor who built one of the first steam-powered locomotives in 1804. It was clumsy, heavy, and slow, but it worked. A spark had been lit. Then came George Stephenson, a man often called the father of railways. In 1825, his locomotive, the Locomotion No. 1, pulled the world's first passenger train on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Just 5 years later, his famous rocket won the Rainhill trials, proving that steam could carry passengers and freight faster than anything seen before. The railway revolution had begun. Within decades, a vast network of iron rails covered Britain. Trains linked cities, carried coal and goods, and transformed the way people experienced distance. What once took days by carriage now took hours. Time itself seemed to accelerate. Railways didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, people, and opportunities. Towns that had once been isolated suddenly thrived. Farmers could sell fresh produce to distant cities. Workers could travel in search of better jobs. The iron tracks became the veins of an industrial nation. At the same time, the iron industry itself was booming. Thanks to innovations like Henry Court's puddling process, iron became easier and cheaper to produce. Iron bridges spanned rivers, iron ships crossed oceans, and factories filled with iron machines hummed with life. But the age of iron soon gave way to something even stronger: steel. In the 1850s, Henry Bessemer developed a process to convert molten iron into steel by blowing air through it. This Bessemer process produced steel that was lighter, tougher, and far more versatile than iron. It became the material of the future, the skeleton of skyscrapers, the rails beneath locomotives, the armor of ships and cannons. Britain's mastery of steam, iron, and steel made it the first true industrial superpower. Its factories and foundries supplied goods to every corner of the world. Its navy, powered by coal and iron, ruled the seas. The phrase "the workshop of the world" was not an exaggeration. It was a statement of dominance. But industry also transformed the way people lived. Cities expanded at an astonishing pace. In 1750, only about 1 in 5 Britons lived in towns. By 1850, more than half the population did. London grew into the largest city on earth. Manchester became the symbol of the modern industrial metropolis, its air thick with smoke, its streets crowded with workers. For many, this new urban life offered opportunity. For others, it brought misery. Families crowded into small, unsanitary tenements. Disease spread rapidly through polluted water and filthy streets. The gap between rich and poor widened dramatically. The factory owners, the new industrial elite, amassed immense fortunes. Meanwhile, their workers labored for 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Women and children were part of this workforce too, often performing the most dangerous and exhausting tasks for the lowest wages. Reformers began to take notice. Writers like Charles Dickens exposed the harsh realities of industrial life in novels such as Hard Times. Politicians and activists called for change, better working conditions, fairer pay, and laws to protect children. Gradually, progress came. The Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s began to limit working hours and improve safety. Trade unions started to form, giving workers a voice. The same revolution that had brought wealth and power was now forcing society to reckon with questions of justice and humanity. Beyond Britain's borders, the effects of industrialization were just as profound. The demand for raw materials and markets drove British expansion across the globe. Cotton came from India and America, sugar and tobacco from the Caribbean, metals from Africa and Asia. Steamships and railways followed, carrying not only goods but also empire. The British Empire became the engine of global industrial capitalism. Its colonies provided the resources and labor. Britain provided the machines, technology, and finished products. The world economy was being rewired, and Britain was at its center. But empire came at a cost. Indigenous peoples were displaced. Local economies were restructured to serve British needs. The same engines of progress that powered factories at home also drove exploitation abroad. Yet to many in Britain, this seemed like the natural order of things, a triumph of civilization and industry. The world was becoming smaller, faster, and more connected than ever before. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain stood at the height of its industrial might. Its steam engines roared across land and sea. Its cities glittered with gaslight. Its factories produced the goods that filled homes from London to Calcutta. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The pace of change was relentless. Pollution poisoned rivers and skies. Workers demanded rights, and rival nations, France, Germany, and the United States, were beginning to industrialize too, eager to challenge Britain's dominance. The Industrial Revolution had made Britain rich and powerful, but it had also set forces in motion that no one could fully control. Progress came with a price, and that price was only beginning to reveal itself. The story of steam and steel is not just about machines and inventions. It's about people, the dreamers, the laborers, the engineers, and the reformers who built a new world from iron and fire, a world of power and promise, but also of struggle and sacrifice. In the next part of this story, we'll explore the social consequences of industrialization, the rise of the working class, the birth of labor movements, and the ways in which Britain began to confront the darker side of progress. The Industrial Revolution was far from over. In many ways, it was only just beginning. By the mid-19th century, Britain was the most powerful industrial nation on earth. Its factories thundered, its railways stretched across the landscape, and its ships ruled the seas. But behind the glittering image of progress lay another story, one of struggle, inequality, and the human cost of rapid change. The Industrial Revolution had transformed work itself. For centuries, labor had been tied to the rhythm of nature, the sunrise, the seasons, the weather. Now work followed the rhythm of machines. Steam engines never slept. Their pace was relentless, their demand for human hands unending. In the dark, crowded factories of Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, men, women, and even children toiled from dawn until long after sunset. The air was thick with dust and smoke. The clatter of machinery was deafening. Accidents were common, and the lucky ones escaped with broken bones. The unlucky ones didn't escape at all. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in cotton mills, crawling beneath spinning frames to clear away lint. In coal mines, boys carried heavy loads through narrow tunnels, their lungs filling with black dust. They worked not because they chose to, but because their families needed every penny to survive. In these cities of smoke and soot, the promise of progress collided with the reality of poverty. Crowded slums grew up around the mills rows of cramped brick houses where whole families shared a single room. Clean water was scarce. Waste ran through open gutters. Epidemics of cholera and typhus swept through the streets with deadly regularity. For the industrial working class, life was a daily struggle. Yet out of this hardship, a new consciousness began to emerge, a realization that their suffering was not inevitable, that together they could demand change. Writers and thinkers began to document and criticize the conditions of industrial life. One of them was Friedrich Engels, a young German who moved to Manchester in the 1840s. What he saw there shocked him. In his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, Engels described a world of filth, misery, and premature death. His words would later inspire revolutionary thinkers across Europe. At the same time, British writers like Charles Dickens used fiction to open the public's eyes. In novels such as Oliver Twist, Hard Times, and Bleak House, Dickens gave voice to the poor, the orphaned, and the forgotten. His stories reached middle-class readers who had never set foot in a factory or slum, stirring empathy and outrage in equal measure. Social reform became a moral crusade. In 1833, Parliament passed the first Factory Act, limiting the working hours of children and requiring factory owners to provide some education. More reforms followed, slowly extending rights to women and men alike, but progress was painfully slow. Many factory owners resisted change, arguing that interference would ruin business. Profit, not people, was still the driving force of the age. Outside the factories, another force was gathering strength, the power of organization. Workers began to form trade unions, pooling their resources to demand fair wages and better conditions. The government saw them as dangerous, even seditious. Union leaders were arrested, their meetings broken up by police, but the movement could not be stopped. The same spirit of invention that built machines now inspired a different kind of creation, the collective voice of the working class. In 1836, the London Working Men's Association was founded, giving birth to the Chartist movement. The Chartists demanded political reform, universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and representation for working people in Parliament. They gathered signatures, held rallies, and presented massive petitions to the government. Though many of their demands were rejected at the time, their ideas planted the seeds of modern democracy. The social upheaval of the industrial age also gave rise to new forms of philanthropy and reform. Religious groups, inspired by a sense of duty, opened schools, orphanages, and soup kitchens. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned against child labor and unsafe working conditions. In 1842, the Mines Act finally banned women and children from working underground. Meanwhile, cities themselves began to adapt. The public health movement gained momentum as doctors and engineers pushed for clean water supplies, sewage systems, and better housing. One of the most influential figures was Edwin Chadwick, whose 1842 report on sanitation revealed the deadly link between poverty, filth, and disease. His work led to the first Public Health Act in 1848, marking a turning point in how society viewed the connection between environment and well-being. For the first time, government began to accept responsibility for the welfare of its citizens. As the decades passed, the industrial landscape continued to evolve. Steam power spread to ships, transforming global trade. Telegraphs connected distant continents with messages that traveled at lightning speed. The world was shrinking, and Britain was at its center. But the more connected and productive society became, the more visible its divisions were. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few industrialists and financiers. Palaces of progress, grand exhibitions, and iron-framed buildings showcased Britain's triumphs, while just beyond their gates the poor still lived in deprivation. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London's Crystal Palace, was the ultimate symbol of this paradox. Beneath its vast glass roof, visitors marveled at machines, inventions, and luxury goods from across the empire. It was a celebration of human ingenuity. Yet for many of Britain's own workers, the wonders on display were dreams beyond reach. Even as reform advanced, new challenges emerged. Industrial pollution darkened the skies and poisoned rivers. Forests were cut down, landscapes scarred by mining and industry. The environmental consequences of progress, largely ignored at the time, were beginning to shape the modern world in ways no one could yet imagine. Still, amid hardship, hope persisted. Education spread. Literacy increased. A growing middle class began to value not only wealth, but culture and morality. Music halls, public libraries, and museums brought knowledge and entertainment to ordinary people. Science and invention became sources of national pride. The same century that produced smoke-belching factories also produced thinkers like Charles Darwin and inventors like Michael Faraday, whose discoveries changed how humanity understood itself and the universe. By the late 19th century, the effects of reform were becoming visible. Child labor declined. Working hours were gradually reduced. Cities grew cleaner and more organized, and Britain's economy, once driven purely by raw power and muscle, began to rely more on knowledge, technology, and management. The Industrial Revolution was evolving into something broader, a social revolution. But for all its achievements, the age of industry left a deep mark on Britain's identity. It had given rise to a new kind of society, urban, industrial, ambitious, and restless. The old rural rhythms were gone. The village had given way to the city, and with it came both opportunity and alienation. Poets like William Blake captured the tension of this new world. He spoke of dark satanic mills, a haunting image of industrial England devouring the innocence of nature. Others saw progress as destiny, proof of human mastery over the earth. Both visions were true in their own way. The Industrial Revolution forced humanity to confront a fundamental question. Could progress and morality coexist? Could machines serve mankind without enslaving it? Britain's answer was still unfolding. By the end of the 19th century, the nation had changed beyond recognition. It was wealthier, more educated, and more connected than ever before. Yet the struggles of the working class, the scars of pollution, and the inequalities of empire remained unresolved. Still, the reforms won during this period by activists, writers, and ordinary people laid the foundation for the modern welfare state, labor rights, and democratic participation. The fight for dignity and justice, born in the smoke of the factories, would continue into the next century. The Industrial Revolution had started as a mechanical transformation, but by its middle decades it had become a human one, a reimagining of what society could be. The world that emerged was complicated, contradictory, and profoundly modern. In the next part of this story, we'll explore how the spirit of industry spread beyond Britain's shores, how Europe, America, and eventually the entire globe entered their own age of machines. The revolution that began on one small island was about to become the world's defining story. The Industrial Revolution was no longer just British. It was becoming universal. By the close of the 19th century, the world had changed forever. The Industrial Revolution, born in the workshops and coal mines of Britain, had reshaped not only a nation, but the entire human story. What began as the mechanical hum of textile looms and the hiss of steam engines now echoed across continents. The smoke that once drifted above Manchester and Birmingham was rising above Paris, Berlin, and New York. The revolution had gone global. Britain, once the pioneer, became the model others sought to follow and to surpass. On the European continent, nations watched Britain's success with a mixture of admiration and urgency. France, Germany, and Belgium began to industrialize rapidly in the mid-19th century. German engineers and chemists in particular turned science into an industrial weapon, developing new dyes, metals, and chemical processes that soon challenged British dominance. In America, the vastness of the land and the abundance of natural resources fueled a different kind of industrial expansion. Steamships and railways connected the Atlantic to the Pacific, uniting a nation through iron rails and ambition. Immigrants poured into the cities, working in factories that produced steel, textiles, and machinery at a staggering scale. By the dawn of the 20th century, the United States had overtaken Britain as the world's largest industrial power. The torch of innovation was passing westward. But industry was not confined to Europe and America. Through empire and trade, the forces of industrialization reached far beyond. In India, British factories demanded cotton, leading to massive shifts in agriculture and local economies. In China, Japan, and Latin America, the industrial world's hunger for markets and materials reshaped entire societies. Japan's story was especially remarkable. Once an isolated feudal state, it transformed almost overnight after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. Determined to modernize, Japan sent students abroad to learn Western science, engineering, and governance. Within decades, it had built railways, shipyards, and steelworks. The land of the samurai became an industrial and military power, proving that modernization was no longer the sole domain of the West. The Industrial Revolution had become a world revolution. But with expansion came exploitation. Industrialized nations carved up Africa and Asia in search of resources and labor. Colonies were forced into the global economy on unequal terms. Producers of raw materials for Western factories, consumers of finished goods they could never hope to compete with. The age of machines, which promised progress, also deepened inequality between nations. Wealth flowed outward from colonies to imperial capitals. The economic and political imbalance of the industrial age would shape global relations for centuries to come. Yet industrialization also brought new connections, railways linking inland cities to ports, telegraph cables spanning oceans, steamships shrinking distances once thought unbridgeable. For the first time in human history, the entire world was linked in a web of commerce, communication, and culture. The pace of life quickened again. Time zones were created to coordinate train schedules. Factories synchronized human lives with the ticking of the clock. The modern obsession with efficiency, productivity, and speed was born. The world entered the 20th century roaring with optimism and with warning signs. The same technologies that built prosperity also forged weapons of unprecedented power. The industrialization of war machine guns, ironclad ships, rail-supplied armies would soon turn Europe's factories into engines of destruction. When the First World War erupted in 1914, it was, in many ways, the dark culmination of the industrial age. The same coal, steel, and chemistry that had powered progress now produced death on an unimaginable scale. The battlefields of the Somme and Verdun were industrial landscapes of mud, metal, and misery. The war demonstrated the double-edged legacy of industrial power, its ability to create and to destroy. After the war, the world stood at a crossroads. Technology continued to advance. Electricity, automobiles, airplanes, and telephones became part of everyday life. Factories grew larger, production faster, and cities taller. The rhythm of industry became the rhythm of modern life. But as machines took over more tasks, people began to ask new questions. What was the purpose of endless growth? Could humanity master its own creations, or had it become enslaved by them? The Great Depression of the 1930s revealed another side of industrial capitalism, the fragility of systems built on profit and production. Factories that once roared with energy fell silent. Millions lost their jobs. Progress, it seemed, was not immune to failure. Yet again, human ingenuity found ways to rebuild. The Second World War brought another wave of technological advancement: radar, synthetic materials, nuclear power. After 1945, the industrial model evolved once more, giving rise to the age of mass production, consumerism, and automation. Britain's dominance had faded, but its legacy endured. The industrial ideas born in its foundries, the use of fossil fuels, the factory system, the pursuit of efficiency had spread to every corner of the earth. Nations like the United States, Japan, and later China would carry the torch of industrial expansion into the modern era. By the late 20th century, the world entered what some called the Second Industrial Revolution, the age of electricity. Oil and steel followed by a third, driven by electronics, computers, and automation. Each new wave built upon the foundations laid in Britain 2 centuries earlier. And now, in the 21st century, we stand on the edge of yet another transformation, the digital revolution. Machines once powered by steam are now powered by data. The hum of looms has become the whir of servers. Factories are replaced by networks, workers by algorithms. But the questions remain the same. How do we balance progress with justice? How do we ensure that innovation serves humanity? rather than the other way around. Looking back, it's clear that the Industrial Revolution was not just a chapter in history, it was the beginning of our modern story. It changed the way we live, work, travel, and think. It taught us that human creativity has no bounds, but also that progress comes with consequences. The world we inhabit today, with its towering cities, global economy, and digital connections, is the direct descendant of that first puff of steam rising above an English coal mine. The revolution that began with spinning wheels and iron engines is still unfolding, only now. Its machines are invisible, its energy drawn from electrons instead of coal. The challenges of our age, climate change, inequality, automation, are the echoes of that first great transformation. The story of the Industrial Revolution is, in the end, the story of us, of our power to invent, to build, and to adapt, of our struggle to balance ambition with compassion and progress with purpose. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of smoke and light, of human hands shaping a world that is still being forged. From the coal mines of 18th century Britain to the data centers of the 21st century, one truth endures. Every revolution begins with a spark, and from that spark humanity builds the future. When we think of the Industrial Revolution, it's easy to picture smoke-filled skies, roaring furnaces, and endless rows of factory workers. But the true revolution ran deeper than machines and engines. It was a transformation of how humanity understood itself, its time, its work, and its purpose. In the centuries before industry, life moved slowly. People measured time by the sun, by the seasons, by the turning of the earth. But when steam engines appeared, time took on a new meaning. Minutes and seconds became precious. Work was scheduled, measured, and quantified. A clock hung on every factory wall, dictating the rhythm of life. This new relationship with time changed everything. It made societies faster, more disciplined, more productive, but it also made them more anxious. For the first time, people felt that they could fall behind, that progress itself was a race. The machine age was not just a technological event. It was a psychological one. It rewired how humans thought about themselves and their place in the world. In the heart of this change was the factory, the new cathedral of the modern age. Here, power no longer came from the muscles of men or the pull of animals, but from the endless motion of pistons and gears. Inside these walls, humans became part of the machine, each person a cog in a vast system of production. For many, this new world offered opportunity, steady wages, a chance to rise above poverty, a sense of belonging in something bigger than oneself. For others, it brought alienation, monotony, and the loss of independence. The craftsman who once shaped wood or metal by hand now stood beside a machine that did the work faster and cheaper. Skill gave way to repetition. Creativity gave way to routine. The philosopher Karl Marx called this phenomenon alienation. He saw workers separated from the fruits of their labor, reduced to extensions of the machines they operated. In his eyes, industrial capitalism had turned humanity into a commodity, a tool for profit, rather than a creator of value. Yet others saw the same system as a triumph. To inventors and entrepreneurs, industry was proof of human genius, the ability to harness nature itself for progress. They argued that factories were the engines of civilization, lifting millions from poverty and fueling an age of science, discovery, and comfort. And both views were true. The Industrial Revolution was never one story. It was thousands of stories woven together, of ambition and exploitation, of innovation and injustice, of beauty and destruction. It was a mirror reflecting the best and worst of what humanity could be. The machines that transformed Britain also transformed art, culture, and thought. Painters began to capture the strange beauty of industrial landscapes, the glow of furnaces at night, the silhouettes of chimneys against the sky. Writers grappled with the contradictions of progress. Poets like William Wordsworth mourned the loss of nature's peace, while others celebrated the heroism of invention. Science, too, was shaped by the industrial spirit. The same curiosity that built steam engines led to breakthroughs in physics, chemistry, and biology. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859, reflected an age obsessed with change, adaptation, and progress. Just as machines evolved to become more efficient, so too did nature itself through struggle and selection. In the classroom and the laboratory, the idea of progress became a religion. Humanity believed it could master the universe through knowledge and technology. The old certainties of religion and tradition began to give way to the new faith of science and industry. But even as progress marched forward, voices of warning emerged. Romantic poets, social reformers, and early environmentalists sensed that something precious was being lost. The land that once sustained generations was being consumed by mines and factories. Rivers that once ran clear now carried the waste of industry. The air that once smelled of rain and soil now reeked of coal. The Industrial Revolution had unleashed humanity's creative power, but not its wisdom. And yet, despite all its costs, the revolution continued to expand human possibility. It gave birth to public education, to the middle class, to modern democracy. It connected distant peoples through trade and communication. It inspired the first labor movements and the first social reforms. It taught society that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. Before the age of industry, most people expected their grandchildren to live much as they did. After it, they began to believe in progress as a birthright, that the future could and should be better than the past. That belief became one of the Industrial Revolution's most powerful legacies. But what does the Industrial Revolution mean to us now, more than 2 centuries later? We live in a world still defined by its consequences. The energy we use, the cities we inhabit, the technology we rely on all trace their origins to that first age of machines. The factories of the 18th century became the assembly lines of the 20th, and the digital networks of the 21st. Our smartphones, cars, and computers are the descendants of the spinning jenny and the steam engine. Our modern global economy, instant, interconnected, and restless, was born in the counting houses and warehouses of industrial Britain. And yet we also live with its shadows. The burning of coal and oil, once symbols of progress, are now the engines of a changing climate. The pollution that darkened Victorian cities now envelops entire regions of the planet. The same drive for growth that built prosperity now threatens the balance of the earth itself. We are, in a sense, still living in the Industrial Revolution. The story did not end, it simply changed form. The challenge we face today is the same one Britain faced 200 years ago. How to reconcile human progress with human and planetary well-being. How to build without destroying. How to innovate without exploiting. How to grow without consuming the very world that sustains us. Looking back, the Industrial Revolution offers lessons hard-earned and vital. It teaches us that innovation has consequences, that power must be tempered by ethics, that technology alone cannot solve the problems it creates. It reminds us that progress is not a straight line, but a balance between what we can do and what we should do. The story of the machine age is also a story of resilience. Every challenge it created poverty, inequality, pollution, eventually inspired a human response. Reformers, scientists, and visionaries rose to meet the crises of their time, proving again and again that humanity could adapt, could learn, could grow, and that may be the greatest legacy of all. The Industrial Revolution was not just about machines replacing hands. It was about minds expanding their reach. It showed that one idea, one invention, could change the destiny of a species. It transformed a small island nation into the workshop of the world, and in doing so, reshaped the future of civilization. Today, as we stand on the brink of another technological revolution, artificial intelligence, automation, and renewable energy, the lessons of that era have never been more relevant. We too are inventors and inheritors of a new world, and like those who came before, we must decide what kind of world we wish to build. Will we allow technology to divide us or to unite us? Will we repeat the mistakes of the past, valuing profit over people, efficiency over empathy, or will we use our knowledge to create a fairer, cleaner, more humane world? The Industrial Revolution reminds us that history is not inevitable. It is the product of human choices made in workshops, in parliaments, in homes, and in hearts. Every engine begins with a spark. Every society begins with an idea. The question now, as it was then, is what we choose to do with it. When we look back at the smoking chimneys of 18th century Britain, we are not just looking at history, we are looking at a mirror. In those faces covered with soot, in those hands building machines, we see ourselves, the same ambition, the same brilliance, the same struggle between greed and generosity, between destruction and creation. The Industrial Revolution never truly ended. It continues in every factory, every invention, every technological leap. It continues in every debate about progress, justice, and the environment. It continues in the way we live, the way we work, and the way we dream. We are all children of that revolution, and perhaps the final lesson it offers is this, that progress is not measured by the power of our machines, but by the wisdom with which we use them. The age of steam may have passed, but the age of humanity, the age of imagination, of courage, of compassion, is still being written. The Industrial Revolution began with fire, iron, and coal. It ends, perhaps, with understanding, and from that understanding, a new kind of revolution can begin. The Industrial Revolution was not a single event, but a long, complex transformation that began in Britain in the late 18th century and forever changed the world. It was a time when invention met ambition, when human ingenuity collided with natural limits, and when a small island nation became the workshop of the world. Before industry, Britain was a land of villages and fields. Most people lived close to the rhythms of nature, sowing, harvesting, and working by the rise and fall of the sun. Power came from muscle, wind, and water. The pace of life was slow, predictable, and largely local. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. In the mid-1700s, new ideas about science, mechanics, and progress began to spread. Britain possessed a unique combination of conditions: rich coal deposits, navigable rivers, a growing population, and a political system that encouraged enterprise. It also had a culture of curiosity, people willing to experiment, to tinker, and to take risks. These forces created a spark, and that spark ignited the Industrial Revolution. At its heart were a few key inventions that changed everything. The spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom revolutionized textile production. Cotton that once took weeks to spin by hand could now be produced in hours. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt, transformed energy itself, making power portable and limitless. Coal became the lifeblood of this new economy, fueling furnaces, driving engines, and lighting cities. Factories began to rise across the British landscape, giant buildings of brick and iron, filled with machines that roared day and night. For the first time in history, production was concentrated under one roof, in a system that valued speed, efficiency, and control. A new class of industrialists emerged, men of ambition and capital, while millions of workers left their villages to labor in the growing towns. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow exploded in size. Streets that had once been quiet were now crowded with carts, smoke, and endless rows of chimneys. The city became a symbol of modern life, dynamic, dirty, and alive. Alongside progress came poverty. Workers endured long hours and dangerous conditions for meager pay. Children were put to work in mines and mills, their small bodies ideal for cramped machines. Disease spread quickly in the slums, where overcrowding and pollution were a daily reality. The Industrial Revolution was both a triumph and a tragedy. It created wealth on a scale the world had never seen, but it also created inequality and hardship. It expanded knowledge, but it tested morality. It lifted nations, but it crushed individuals. And yet, amid the smoke and suffering, there was also hope. Reformers began to speak out. Writers like Charles Dickens exposed injustice. Activists fought for labor laws, public education, and political reform. Step by step, society began to adapt to the new age it had created. The changes were not only social, they were also global. Britain's factories demanded raw materials and new markets. The empire expanded, stretching across continents. Cotton from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and metals from Africa all fed the industrial machine. Steamships and railways connected the world, shrinking distance and accelerating trade. The Industrial Revolution made Britain rich, but it also tied its prosperity to the exploitation of others, a legacy that still shapes global relationships today. Technology continued to evolve. Iron gave way to steel, canals gave way to railways, and hand labor gave way to mechanization. In less than a century, Britain moved from a rural society to an urban industrial power. Science flourished, education spread, and the idea of progress became a central part of modern identity. For the first time, people believed that the future could be different from the past, that invention and effort could overcome any obstacle. But this new faith in progress came with costs. The natural world suffered. Forests were cleared, rivers polluted, and the air filled with smoke. The land that had once been green and quiet was transformed into a landscape of factories and mines. The poet William Blake called them dark satanic mills, symbols of a world where nature and humanity seemed at odds. The Romantic movement arose in response, artists and thinkers searching for beauty and meaning amid the roar of industry. Despite these tensions, the Industrial Revolution unleashed humanity's creative power. It inspired new philosophies, from capitalism to socialism. It redefined the meaning of work, wealth, and time itself. The factory clock became the heartbeat of modern life. Every minute could now be measured, managed, and sold. Time became money, and speed became virtue. This was not just an economic revolution, it was a mental one. The way people thought about themselves, their labor, and their place in the world fundamentally changed. The idea of the individual capable of invention, responsible for success, grew stronger. But so too did feelings of alienation, as workers became mere cogs in the industrial machine. Thinkers like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels saw this clearly. They argued that the new system exploited human labor and divided society into classes, the few who owned the means of production and the many who worked for them. Their ideas would inspire political movements that shaped the next 2 centuries. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution opened doors that had long been closed. Public education spread. Middle classes grew. New professions emerged. Women, though still marginalized, began to enter the workforce and demand rights. The concept of democracy expanded as more people demanded a voice in the systems that governed their lives. By the mid-19th century, Britain stood at the height of its power. Its ships controlled the seas, its goods filled the world's markets, and its technologies defined the modern age. But other nations were catching up. The revolution that began in Britain spread to Europe, America, and eventually the globe. The world was now industrial, interconnected, and forever changed. The legacy of this transformation is everywhere. Our cities, our economies, and our technologies all descend from that age of innovation. The steam engine became the internal combustion engine. The telegraph evolved into the Internet. The patterns established in the 18th and 19th centuries' rapid growth, global trade, and environmental strain still define our world today. The Industrial Revolution also taught us a deeper lesson about human nature. It showed that progress is possible, but never without cost. It revealed our genius and our greed, our compassion and our cruelty. It proved that technology can amplify both the best and the worst within us. As we look back, we can see its echoes in our own time. The digital age is a new kind of industrial revolution, driven by data instead of steam, by algorithms instead of engines. The same questions return. How do we balance innovation with humanity? How do we use power without abusing it? How do we ensure that progress serves everyone, not just the privileged few? The answers lie in understanding where we came from. The story of Britain's Industrial Revolution is not just a story of machines, it is a story of people, of inventors who dared to dream, workers who endured unimaginable hardship, and reformers who fought for justice. It is a story of cities rising from fields, of nations reshaping the earth, and of humanity learning for the first time to harness its own potential on a massive scale. The Industrial Revolution began with fire, coal, and iron, but it continues today in every innovation that changes how we live. It is a reminder that history is not something that happens to us. It is something we create. And in that sense, the revolution never truly ended. It continues in every factory, every lab, every line of code. It continues in every question we ask about fairness, sustainability, and the meaning of progress. It continues in every challenge to build a better world. When we look back at the dark chimneys of 18th century Britain, we are not just studying the past, we are looking into a mirror. The same energy that drove those early engineers drives us still. The same desire to build, to improve, to understand, is the force that propels civilization forward. But the lesson of history is clear. Progress without conscience leads to ruin. The power to create must be balanced by the wisdom to preserve. The machines that once lifted humanity from poverty can also, if unchecked, endanger the planet that sustains us. And so, as we stand in the shadow of a new technological age, we must remember the story of the first one, the story of how the modern world began, and what it cost to build it. The story of how a nation's curiosity lit the fuse of progress, and how that fire spread across the earth. The Industrial Revolution was more than an age of machines. It was the birth of the modern mind. It taught us to look forward, to question, to imagine. It showed that the world could be remade, but that every act of creation carries responsibility. From the spinning wheels of Lancashire to the furnaces of Birmingham, from the railways that bound a nation to the ideas that reshaped its soul, the Industrial Revolution remains one of the most profound chapters in human history. It reminds us that we are capable of extraordinary things. That progress is not inevitable, but intentional, and that the story of humanity is above all the story of invention, of striving, failing, learning, and beginning again. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, but its legacy belongs to all of us. It is written in the cities we build, the technologies we use, and the choices we make. And as we look to the future toward new machines, new revolutions, and new challenges, we carry with us the same question that faced those who came before. What will we create next? And what kind of world will it build?